In the autumn of 1935, inside a crowded showroom in New York City, a car appeared that had no business existing. It had no visible headlights. It had no running boards. It sat low to the ground like something that had been poured into shape rather than built, and when people leaned in close to study it, they noticed something even stranger. The front wheels were not just steering this car, they were pulling it. In a country where every single automobile pushed itself forward from the rear axle, this one was reaching out with its front wheels and dragging itself into the future. Nobody in that showroom had ever seen anything like it. Sales clerks could not keep the crowds back. Men in wool suits climbed over each other just to touch the hood. Orders were being scribbled down faster than anyone could process them, for a car that, in truth, was not even close to finished. 18 months later, the company that built it would not exist. Its founder would be gone from the country, chased out by a federal investigation. The factory would sit silent. And the car itself, a machine so radically ahead of its era that a piece of it would eventually hang inside one of the most respected museums in America as a work of art, would all but vanish from the story the world tells about American cars. This is the story of the Cord 810. And by the time this video is over, you will understand exactly why the giants of Detroit had every reason in the world to let it disappear. Here is where the story ends, before we tell you how it began. Today, a surviving Cord 810, or its sibling, the 812, is one of the most sought-after machines in classic car collecting. Serious buyers travel across continents to bid on one. Restorers spend years and small fortunes bringing a single example back to life. Design historians teach it in university courses as one of the most important pieces of industrial design the 20th century ever produced. It sits permanently in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, chosen specifically because its designers treated a car the way a sculptor treats bronze. And yet, if you asked 100 people on the street to name it, maybe one would recognize the shape, and almost none would know the name. That gap between how important this car actually was and how completely it was erased from public memory is not an accident of history. It is the residue of a fight this company lost against forces far bigger than one factory in a small Indiana town could ever hope to survive. To understand how that fight was lost, we need to rewind, back past the showroom, back past the crowds, back to the man who built the company in the first place. His name was Errit Lobban Cord, and by the time he was 30 years old, he had already failed and rebuilt himself more times than most men manage in a lifetime. He had raced cars, he had sold cars, he had gone broke and clawed his way back more than once. In the early 1920s, he was hired to rescue a struggling Indiana automaker called Auburn, a company that was drowning in unsold inventory and heading toward bankruptcy. Cord did not just rescue it. He repainted the unsold stock in bold, aggressive colors, restyled what he could, and sold out the entire backlog within a year. That single move told the industry everything it needed to know about him. He understood something most engineers and accountants did not. He understood desire. He understood that a car was not just a machine that moved a person from one place to another. It was a statement. It was theater. And over the following decade, Cord built an empire around that idea, folding in the legendary Duesenberg brand, an aviation company, and a sprawling network of businesses, all built on the same instinct: build something people cannot stop looking at, and the money will follow. By the early 1930s, Cord's Auburn brand had already produced cars that shocked the industry, supercharged speedsters that set land speed records at Bonneville and sold for a fraction of what comparable performance cost from anyone else. But Cord wanted something bigger. He wanted a car that did not just look different. He wanted a car that was engineered differently, down to its bones. A car that broke the fundamental architecture every other American manufacturer had settled into. He handed that challenge to a small, ferociously talented design and engineering team, and told them to build something that had never existed before. What they came back with would either save his company or bury it. As it turned out, it would do both. The car they built was front-wheel drive, at a time when front-wheel drive on an American road car was almost unheard of. The idea had circled the racing world for years, borrowed loosely from the front-driven race cars that Ford's own racing program had experimented with, but almost nobody had dared put it into mass production. The engineering logic was elegant. Without a driveshaft running the length of the car to the rear wheels, the entire vehicle could sit lower to the ground. There was no need for the tall central hump running through the floor that every rear-wheel drive car forced onto its passengers. The car could be sleeker, flatter, more stable in corners, more modern in every sense of the word. On paper, it was a masterpiece of thinking differently. Then there was the face of the car, or rather, the complete absence of one. Every automobile on the road in 1935 had two glass eyes bolted onto the front fenders, headlights standing proud and exposed like something out of the previous century. The design team, led by a young stylist barely in his 30s named Gordon Berrig, decided the headlights simply should not be visible at all. Working with Ford's engineers, they built a mechanism that let the headlights fold completely flat into the fenders, hidden until the driver reached down and cranked them up by hand. It sounds almost primitive today, but in 1935 it was witchcraft. A car with a face that could disappear. Nothing on American roads looked remotely like it. There were no running boards either. Another sacred convention of the era simply discarded, because the engineers decided the car did not need them, and the stylists decided they ruined the silhouette. The hood was long, flat, and wrapped in horizontal chrome louvers that curved around the nose like the gills of some sleek mechanical animal, a shape so distinctive that people would later nickname it the coffin nose, a name that, in hindsight, turned out to be far more fitting than anyone intended at the time. The man responsible for that shape was barely out of his 20s. Gordon Berrig had been bouncing between design studios for years, chasing work wherever the industry would take him, before Ford's team gave him a freedom almost no stylist of that era ever received. Build the car exactly as you see it in your head, with no committee softening the edges. Berrig treated the assignment less like an engineering brief and more like a sculpture commission, working out the final proportions of that flat, louvered hood with sheer stubbornness, refusing to let the manufacturing team talk him into a single visible headlight or a single exposed running board. It is easy, looking back from a world full of sleek cars, to forget how genuinely strange this looked to 1935 eyes. Every design cue on the road at that moment screamed height, verticality, visible machinery proudly on display. Berrig's car did the opposite. It hugged the ground, it hid its mechanics, it dared people to wonder how it worked instead of showing them. That single decision, to make a car mysterious instead of obvious, is a big part of why crowds could not stop staring at it in that New York showroom. And it is exactly the kind of decision that only gets made when nobody with real financial power is standing over your shoulder demanding you play it safe. Inside, the transmission was just as radical as everything on the outside. Instead of a traditional manual gearbox with a floor-mounted stick, the Ford used something called a pre-selector transmission, controlled by a small lever on the steering column connected to an electric and vacuum-operated system. The driver would select the next gear in advance, then simply lift off the accelerator for a fraction of a second, and the car would shift itself. It was, in essence, an attempt at something close to an automatic transmission, years before automatics became standard in American cars. When it worked, it felt like driving something sent back from decades in the future. And that phrase, when it worked, is exactly where this story starts to turn. Because here is the truth that the glossy magazine photos and the mobbed showroom crowds did not show you. When the Ford 810 was unveiled to the public in November of 1935, it was not actually finished. The demand created by that first unveiling was so overwhelming, so far beyond what anyone at the company expected, that Ford's leadership made a decision that would haunt the entire project. They rushed it into production before the engineering was fully sorted out. Some of the earliest cars shown to the public were essentially hand-built prototypes, pushed onto the showroom floor to meet a deadline tied to tax regulations on new model announcements, with production versions still being frantically finalized in the workshop behind them. The company had, in effect, promised the world a finished symphony while the musicians were still learning their parts. The cracks showed up almost immediately. That elegant pre-selector transmission, so magical when it worked, was maddeningly unreliable in the real world. The vacuum lines that controlled the gear changes were sensitive to cold weather, and customers in northern states found their brand-new, wildly expensive automobile refusing to shift properly the moment temperatures dropped. The front-wheel drive system, the very heart of what made this car revolutionary, relied on universal joints that were not true, constant velocity joints, meaning they wore down faster than they should have under the stress of pulling rather than pushing the entire weight of the vehicle. Owners who had waited months and paid a small fortune began quietly bringing their cars back to dealers, not to show them off anymore, but to have them repaired. Word of mouth, the very thing that had built the frenzy around this car in the first place, began working against it. The same conversations happening on golf courses and at country clubs that once buzzed with excitement about the car with no headlights and no running boards started to include a quieter, more damaging phrase: "It is beautiful, but it breaks down." Picture the scene playing out in driveways across the country that winter. A proud new owner, someone who had waited months and paid more than most families earned in a year, climbing in on a frozen morning, reaching for that elegant column-mounted shift lever, expecting the future to glide into gear the way it had in the showroom demonstration. Instead, nothing. A hesitation, a grinding refusal. The most futuristic car in America, stubborn and lifeless in the cold, while the neighbor's plain, unglamorous Ford started on the first try and pulled out of the driveway without a second thought. That contrast, repeated in enough driveways in enough cities, is what actually killed this car, long before any boardroom in Detroit had to lift a finger. But do not stop watching yet, because the reason those failures mattered so much more for this company than for any of its rivals is about to become painfully clear. And this is exactly the moment when the story stops being about one flawed car and starts being about who actually survives a crisis like this. Because Ford's company was not the only automaker feeling pain in the middle of the 1930s. The entire American auto industry was standing in the wreckage of the Great Depression, and it is here that the difference between an independent innovator like Ford and the giants of Detroit becomes brutally, permanently clear. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were not simply bigger companies. They were fortresses. They had decades of accumulated capital reserves. They had dealer networks stretching into every corner of the country, financing arms that could carry customers through hard times, and enough diversified product lines that a stumble in one model did not threaten to sink the entire company. When a Chevrolet or a Ford had a bad year, the company absorbed it and kept moving. When an independent manufacturer like Ford's operation had a bad year, there was no cushion. There was no second division quietly propping up the balance sheet. There was only the next payroll, the next supplier invoice, and a shrinking pile of cash standing between survival and collapse. This was not a level playing field, and it was never going to be. The Depression did not just punish bad decisions. It ruthlessly punished anyone without the size and capital to absorb a bad decision. And, by design, that meant it protected the biggest players in Detroit, while it quietly strangled almost every independent automaker willing to take the kind of risk that had made the Ford 810 possible in the first place. Auburn, Ford, and Duesenberg were not alone in this. Across the decade, one storied independent name after another buckled under the same pressure. Pierce Arrow, Marmon, Stutz, brands that had once rivaled anything Detroit produced, all fell during this same window, unable to match the financial armor of the Big Three. The lesson the industry learned, quietly and permanently, was that innovation without a fortress behind it was a luxury only the largest players could actually afford to survive. Every time an independent company like Ford's took a bold swing and stumbled even slightly, it made the case, again and again, that only the giants deserved to define what an American car should be. That is not a conspiracy carried out in a smoke-filled room. It did not need to be. It was simply how the economics of survival worked, and Detroit's biggest manufacturers benefited from it whether they lifted a finger or not. But if the Depression alone were not enough pressure, the man at the center of this entire empire was about to face a storm of his own making. Eret Loban Cord had spent the 1930s not just building cars but aggressively trading the stock of his own companies, and by 1937 federal regulators had grown deeply suspicious of the pattern. The newly formed Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into Cord's financial dealings, examining allegations that he had manipulated the stock price of his own corporation. For a man whose entire empire ran on confidence, on the perception that his companies were unstoppable, a federal fraud investigation was close to a death sentence. Rather than stay and fight it out in American courtrooms, Cord effectively stepped back from the businesses that carried his name, quietly began liquidating pieces of his empire, and largely disappeared from the automotive industry he had once dominated by sheer force of personality. The man who had built his entire career on making people believe in a vision could no longer make people believe in him. Between a car that broke down more than it should have, a national economy that punished anyone without deep enough pockets to weather a storm, and a founder now more concerned with federal investigators than with front-wheel drive engineering, the outcome was no longer really in question. In August of 1937, less than 2 years after that electric unveiling in New York, the Auburn Automobile Company shut down its production lines for the final time. Auburn, Cord, Duesenberg, three of the most audacious names in American automotive history, all extinguished within the same collapse. The factory floor that had once struggled to keep up with demand for the most talked-about car in the country went silent. Unsold inventory was liquidated for pennies on the dollar. Employees who had built some of the most advanced automobiles in the world were suddenly out of work in the middle of the worst economic collapse the country had ever seen. And the men running General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler did not have to do anything at all to make this happen. They simply had to keep standing while everyone smaller collapsed around them, and then quietly absorb whatever ideas from the wreckage were worth keeping. Here is the part of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it is the part that should genuinely make you angry. Several of the ideas that got the Cord 810 labeled a failure went on to become standard practice across the entire industry, once the bigger manufacturers had the time and resources to engineer them properly. Hidden headlights, the very feature that made showroom crowds gasp in 1935, reappeared decades later on some of the most celebrated performance cars ever built. Cars whose designers openly cited the Cord as an influence. Front-wheel drive, dismissed as an unreliable curiosity in the 1930s, eventually became the default layout for the vast majority of cars built on Earth. Once the very same constant velocity joint technology that Cord's engineers lacked finally matured. The company that took the risk, that put its name and its money and its founder's reputation on the line to prove these ideas could work, was not the company that got to profit from them. It went bankrupt while proving the concept. The giants who could afford to wait simply waited, watched the smaller company absorb all the risk and all the failure, and then borrowed the good ideas once the technology finally caught up. That, right there, is the quiet, unglamorous version of how Detroit made sure this car would be forgotten. Not through sabotage, not through secret meetings, through something far more effective and far harder to put on trial, an economic system stacked so heavily in favor of the largest players that any independent daring enough to leap ahead of the pack was almost guaranteed to be the one who paid the price for that leap, while the safer, slower giants collected the benefits years later without ever having to take the risk themselves. The story that got told afterward, in trade magazines and industry retrospectives written largely by people connected to the surviving manufacturers, was a simple one. The Cord failed because it was unreliable. Full stop. End of story. Nothing more to see. That version conveniently leaves out the part where an entire economic and financial system was tilted against anyone without the size to survive a stumble, and it leaves out the part where the very same big three manufacturers who told that simple story went on to use the Cord's most radical ideas as soon as it was safe and profitable to do so. For decades after the factory closed, the surviving Cord 810s and 812s scattered into private garages, forgotten barns, and small pockets of enthusiasts who refused to let the story die completely. It took collectors and design historians working largely outside the official narrative of the big automakers to slowly rebuild this car's reputation. In 1951, the Museum of Modern Art in New York staged an exhibition called 8 Automobiles, treating cars as legitimate works of industrial sculpture rather than mere transportation. The Cord was one of the machines chosen to represent that idea, placed on a pedestal in a room built for art, decades after Detroit's official story had already written it off as a failed experiment. Today, when a well-preserved Cord 810 or 812 comes up at a major classic car auction, it routinely commands a price in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a figure that would have seemed almost absurd to the dealers frantically liquidating unsold inventory back in 1937. So the next time you see a modern supercar with headlights that vanish into a sculpted hood or slide behind the wheel of an ordinary front-wheel drive sedan without giving its layout a second thought, remember where that idea actually came from. It came from a small, financially fragile company in Auburn, Indiana, that dared to build something the giants were not yet willing to risk. It came from a design team barely out of their 20s who decided a car could be treated as art rather than appliance. It came from a founder who bet everything he had built on a machine that was, in the end, launched about a year too early and about one economic depression too late. Detroit did not need to erase the Cord 810 with malice. All it had to do was survive long enough to write the history books and let a company with no financial armor absorb the entire cost of proving an idea that everyone else would eventually steal for free. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled us in while researching it, this channel exists entirely for stories exactly like this one, the machines that got buried by circumstances bigger than themselves, and the people who paid the price for being right too soon. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop a comment telling us which forgotten car deserves this same treatment, and if you made it all the way to this final second, thank you, because that is exactly what a car this brilliant deserved all along. Someone willing to see the entire story through to the end.